So that was a huge part of it. A lot of it was because I saw what you could do with open source.
Or if you have an experience to share in terms of making that argument.
Yeah, there were two main fears. One was that I think the bigger thing that I've tried to think about and push is like contributing back and the importance of doing that. Because you being able to share that back to the community, to the Razor Rods forums at the time, and see what other people thought of it. There was like another guy that made like some YouTube video reviews of the stuff that I did. It was, you can also learn like certain things if you have enough information. You can learn something about something that they are doing that they're implicitly agreeing to by keeping the status quo. You can also sort of shock them with the status quo in that way, and that can often get them to.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is freedom.
Open source is great collaboration.
Open source is good engineering.
Open source is not a business model.
Open source is community.
Open source is interesting.
Open source is the future.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Yeah, let's start recording. This sounds like fun.
I'm super excited for today's episode because we will be, of course, talking about open source, and we are talking about it more from contributor perspective and talking about the perspective of someone who's been involved in open source as a software developer and someone who's getting his hands dirty. So we have Wayne Starr here with us today, and we will dive into his open source experience. But before we do that, Wayne, I would like to ask you to tell a little bit about yourself. What is your background in tech, and what do you do today?
Yeah, so I grew up in rural Colorado, and mostly kind of got into computers and technology from a lot of my dad owned a lot of real estate offices, and whenever their computers would get decommissioned, they'd wind up in our garage. And so me and my brother would go in there and take them into our house and build whatever Franken machines we could, mostly in DOS and Windows, and just trying to, just see what we could do with them. And so that was a lot of fun, and kind of got into it that way. I learned I wanted to program. I had kind of gotten some exposure to that in middle school, high school, and decided that software engineering was what I wanted to do. And so I decided to go to Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York, and get my degree in software engineering up there. I also was interested in kind of the military and potentially serving, looking at it initially as a way to pay for college as well. So I also did ROTC, Air Force ROTC up there. And then that, I really enjoyed doing that and kind of getting involved in things. RIT was also a co-op school, so they have you work for a year. So I got the chance to intern at Microsoft and also work for my school for a little bit. And then I commissioned in 2016 into the United States Air Force. And so my year group was a little weird that year because they basically the training backlog got too long. And it was going to be over a year before I would even go on active duty, which Congress basically forces the Air Force to pay you when you, if that happens. And so Congress basically said, instead of sending these second lieutenants to training, you're going to send them everywhere across the country. And I got the opportunity to go to Defense Innovation Unit out in California at Moffett Field in Silicon Valley, which was kind of cool for a software engineer to be able to go out there in the Air Force. That was a really special experience. There, I was able to be a part of the software, what became known as the software factory movement within the Air Force. We started with a tool called the Tanker Planner tool, which basically helped aerial refueling be planned. So, like if a F-16 is going to go somewhere and then it needs to be refueled by KC-135, how are you going to actually plan that out? And the way they had been doing that for the longest time was on a whiteboard with Excel. Like literally like moving magnetic pucks around. And so we actually went out to Qatar, interviewed them, brought in modern software development practices, and built them a web application that we deployed to their production environment in about 6 months. And that was pretty special for the Department of Defense because the previous program that we were kind of competing against, called AOC 10.2, Air Operations Center 10.2 upgrade, they had started development in 2006, and by 2017 hadn't delivered anything to production. So they were on their traditional waterfall flow, and so that was kind of cool to be able to be a part of that. I was able to expand that out into lots of other sort of domains within the Air Force. Worked a bit on counter unmanned aerial systems. Worked a bit with actual doing like offensive cyber operations development, like malware development, effectively. And then decided to get out of the Air Force, mostly because I wanted to stay a dev. I love software engineering and actually writing software, and slowly got pulled further and further away from it. And so in 2022, I joined Defense Unicorns on their ZARF project, and then I became tech lead of that in 2023. And then now I've switched over to our Defense Unicorns software factory capability that basically is providing a lot of the same tools that I was using all along while I was in the Air Force. So I've been a long, watcher of the open source space, and I've really obviously was a big user of it throughout all that time, and I really saw what it could kind of do in the Department of Defense, and what things you could really practically do with it, and so I wanted to be a part of that coming out of that.
Do you remember when you first learned about open source, that open source software existed and that
Yep.
there are communities?
Yeah, I first learned about it in 2007. So growing up in rural Colorado, I had dial-up internet for a very long time, and it was on one computer in the house. So I didn't really spend a lot of time online learning about stuff. But in 2007, we finally moved downtown and got cable internet. And I had also just gotten a new computer, Windows Vista, at the time. And so my old Pentium 3 gateway machine, I wanted to be able to get it online and do something with it. And I was like, well, what can I do with this thing? I don't know. I was running Windows 98 on it before. And so I found this Linux thing, and found people were recommending Ubuntu. And so I installed Ubuntu 7.10 on it. And yeah, I still remember as a kid opening up the Software Center and seeing all the open source games that were there, Sauerbraten, Tuxcart, Rigs of Rods and stuff, and just being kind of amazed that all this software was there. Because this was pre-iPhone, pre-App Store, but so this was a totally weird concept to discover and find. And so yeah, so that was kind of fun to get into. And for a while, I kind of split the difference between Windows and Linux, because I had still grown up with Windows, Windows 95, 98, and XP. And so I stayed in that for a little bit, and then I kind of started going more fully into open source in college, where I got actually a System 76 laptop and started running Linux more full time.
Was the school having any programs around open source, or where you could get in touch with open source, or was that more you doing it on your time and just using open source software?
Yeah, RIT had some stuff where they would talk about some of that, and there were other obviously Linux user groups and things there, and they run mirrors for Arch Linux and some stuff, and that was some of where I got into it. In high school and before, though, there was basically nothing, so I had to kind of figure that out on my own. But yeah.
What drew you to open source? Was that the fact that you had access to all those things that you found online, or was there more, especially after you were not a kid anymore?
Yeah, I think it was some of the freedom that was there. So one of the first things I kind of got into was actually Rigs of Rods, which is an open source soft body physics simulator. And so later high school and into college, building mods for that game, and being able to make my own maps. I made a little Cushman industrial truck, which is this little electric truck thing, but I made it in the game, and you could play. I made a soccer map that actually had working soccer goals and different things in AngelScript. And so the freedom to take something and then bring my own ideas to life, that whatever I wanted to do was really really fun. And then being able to share that back to the community, to the Briggs and Rods forums at the time, and see what other people thought of it. There was like another guy that made like some YouTube video reviews of the stuff that I did. It was fun to be a part of like that kind of community, to see like what's going on with all this stuff, and what do other people create, and how do other people build off of what other people have built, and it kind of like expands and grows over time.
So I assume we could say that your first experience with open source, not just as a user, but also someone who gives back to the community, was a good one, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it was. Yep. Yeah. And it kind of continued to be good even before I joined Defense Unicorns. I wanted to actually contribute to like what I would quote unquote a real project, because the game is fun, but like a real one. And it was actually the first one that I made to GitHub, to a project in GitHub, was the browser compat data for the Mozilla Developer Network, because I was exploring. I wanted to basically take my personal website and make it work for Internet Explorer 5, because that's what I grew up with, and I kind of missed some of that early time of messing around on the internet. And so I was working with reading books on JScript and the ECMAScript 1.0 and all that stuff. And then I found out that there was a small little error in the MDN on the versions. They said there was IE6 for 4 in support, but it was actually IE3 that was introduced. And so I was able to make that. And that was a fun experience too. And the contributor even said it's fun, reading old docs. The maintainer said it was fun reading old docs, and stuff, and seeing my PR show up. So that was kind of a fun thing to do as well, is to kind of like explore these other places and then be able to give back. And a lot of my time, that was also especially fun because when I was working for my school, and in the Air Force as well, a lot of what I did was web development. So I used the MDN a lot, and being able to contribute back to that was really fun too.
Before we dive into the open source bits and pieces, can you just really briefly describe what Defense Unicorns does for people who never heard of the organization?
Yeah, so we're a U.S. Department of defense contractor, that mostly focuses on secure supply chain delivery and platforms engineering. So we have a couple open source tools that we've developed, like Zarf, which is our air gap software delivery solution. So it'll take things like Docker images, Kubernetes manifests, Git repositories, allow you to package them up and bring them into an air gap and deploy your software there. So that's Apache 2 licensed, and we actually just donated that to OpenSSF. We also have a couple other projects, Pepper, which is a mutating webhook within Kubernetes, that can help you implement operator patterns or validation patterns, things like that. And so we're using that internally for some of our software to help us scale up the applications that we develop, so we can develop those faster. And then we also have Lula, which is a compliance validation software. So we probably may get into this later, but there's this whole risk management framework process within the Department of Defense and across the federal government, that you basically have to abide by. That has changed a lot. Like, that really was mandated in 2014 by Congress and the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014. But there's been a lot of innovation since then. And in 2021, NIST created OSCAL, the Open Source Controls Assessment, or Open Security Controls Assessment language, and that is really what Lula is trying to build off of, to allow controls implementations to be written as code, and to live with the code, and to be aggregated and processed that way. So it kind of helps build an API around this stuff, which is really cool to see finally, instead of dealing with Excel sheets and manual answers for things. And then we also have our Leapfrog product, which is kind of our AI, bringing AI to the air gap product, because there's a lot of things that you could potentially do with that in an air gap. And we feel that's important for the mission to enable certain things.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that, as far as what AI you can bring to Zarf and the air gap?
For the most part, it's been large language models. So some use cases would be stuff like translation, where if you're like doing certain intel analysis on something and you need to try to speed up something like a process like that, it reduces a lot of the burden on these people who are honestly like downrange, working 12-hour shifts, 6-7 days a week. It provides an additional tool to them to help do their jobs more easily and faster.
When you came to Defense Unicorns, I assume that it was already clear that you will work on open source projects.
Mhm.
Was it part of the decision to come to Defense Unicorns specifically? Like, was it something that was appealing to you, or it was just a circumstance as any other?
Yeah, I would say it was a core requirement. I actually basically left the Air Force because of Defense Unicorns and only applied to Defense Unicorns. So that was a huge part of it. A lot of it was because I saw what you could do with open source in the Department of Defense, and I knew that if there was a company that could answer these sorts of questions and needs that people could actually tangibly hold and contribute back to, that it could be very, very impactful. There's a lot of very, very smart people in the Air Force and Navy, Army, and everywhere that really care about the mission and want to get things done. But a lot of times their hands are somewhat tied. If they want to bring in a whatever piece of software or whatever thing, they're going to have to figure out how to do that. And if they have to pay for it, then they're going to have to go through the acquisitions process, which can take years. And so it really hamstrings you. And there can be a lot of layers to that really get in the way. One of the conversations that I remember fighting with one of our wing security folks was about our telephone systems. Because during COVID, we obviously were on lots of Teams calls and things, and so we bought headsets for all of our personnel. But because they were headsets and not handsets, even though they used the same port, they didn't understand the technology well enough to know that they're the same thing, and so they banned them. And then we fought with them to get our headsets back. We eventually did get our headsets back, but then leadership at the wing changed, and then they came back down and banned them again and took our headsets away. And so everybody has phone neck, just holding their phones next to their ear, because the security people at those higher levels weren't understanding the technology deep enough. And so it was that was a lot of why I got out, because I was tired of fighting with policy and some of this other stuff, and I knew that if I could move to building some technology and giving that technology directly to the people that are going to be implementing that technology, that you could actually make a bigger difference, and get things done a little bit, without involving them as much. And you still answer some of their questions along the way, obviously with SBOMs and things, but but you can really make a big impact. And the other thing is that all those smart people who are everywhere across the military, they can contribute back. And we've had people I formerly worked with, other people have formerly worked with, who have contributed to our projects and solved their own problems for themselves. Which is a really powerful thing. Like, we don't need to know anything about their use case. We don't need to be working with them, next to them in their secure containerized information facility that we have no access to. They can have the full context of their problems and then implement fixes and push them upstream, and then get the benefits of that as it flows back downstream. And so the power that's possible there, in building that technology and kind of giving it away, while still making money because you need to, but that was really what drew me to Defense Unicorns and that ethos. And the company was founded by three folks. One of them, though, was Jeff McCoy, who I had worked with back in those early Kessel Run days. And so he had kind of a deep open source mantra, and also strongly believed in this, and had seen how it could really impact a lot of what the Air Force needed. And a lot of the software factory technologies, they were all built on open source stuff for the most part. Even from the web apps, from Spring and Angular and React and all that stuff, to eventually later with Platform One, their full open source Kubernetes platform that they were building and pushing out to various software factories around the Air Force. And so the impact that it had on the DoD, and then the chance to give back and continue pushing this forward in ways that the DoD needs to have happen, was really what brought me to it.
So to summarize a little bit, like, part of the reason to choose a company that does open source was a little bit of a personal freedom. And on the other hand, how that freedom also contributes to technology evolution, innovation, and just having access to that ecosystem of like-minded and very smart people who are not necessarily in your organization. They can be anywhere. Is that
Right.
an accurate way to summarize?
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of personal reasons to get into open source. For my own, I run Linux every day, and that's a lot of fun. And then yeah, I definitely like being able to push the bounds of what technology is and could be. Another space besides the air gap use cases that I spent a lot of time in was dealing with the risk management framework, dealing with controls answers and things like that. Um, Very familiar with the Excel regimen, and then you try to port those controls into EMAS or Exacta, which are the actual like websites that you actually go to input all that data and track it. And just how laborious and kind of annoying that is, because the developers don't really know what the security people are talking about, and the controls are written at a very high level, and nobody kind of knows what's going on. And I was able to see a lot of the innovation that was happening back in, from 18F, GSA, General Services Administration, and NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, that flowed into the Air Force from some of the stuff that they were doing. And seeing that evolve has been really, really cool. 18F made a thing before OSCAL existed called Open Control, which was an open source project that they made to try to do the controls as code thing. Unfortunately, it didn't get enough adoption, and kind of is now mostly dead. But OSCAL is there to kind of come in, and luckily it has the backing of NIST, so I think it has a bigger chance to actually get adoption, because it's not just some random government agency doing this; it's NIST. And so that is super exciting because back then I looked at Open Control back in like 2017 and saw like this could be really awesome because at the time we were doing some Next.js stuff with Express, but you could around your single sign-on provider integration, you could have like code annotations that could generate open control documentation and then have that feed into another system, and it all lives as code and it works as this. And if you build it that way, then like everybody can take advantage of that, and it basically is similar to how people have built APIs around continuous integration and all these other things. Like you should be able to do this for compliance too. And having it all out in the open is just a bonus. I don't think we would have been able to do what Kessel Run did without 18F having public GitHub repositories. Because being able to see their implementation of how they were answering controls and doing some of those system security plans and various other, like these are all policy documents, but they had examples out there on GitHub. It allowed us to kind of take that information, learn from them what exactly they were doing, and then apply it to our own problems. And I never actually talked to anybody at 18F or GSA, but I knew that they existed and I knew they had public GitHub repos and I could go and look at them and learn from them. And so that also is really powerful from an information sharing perspective, even in like sort of pseudocode or non-coded places as well.
So it does feel that because of the open environment, things can be done faster, and it's sometimes it's just easier even if you don't talk to a single person.
Right. Yeah, you can discover information and new ways of thinking and new ways of doing stuff a lot more easily, and you're not so siloed into the way your predecessor taught you to do it, because that's how it's always been done here. So,
Yeah, technology moves fast enough that if you stay stovepiped, you lose it pretty quickly.
Yep, you do. Yeah, my dad always described it as a train, and you better get on the train early and never get off the train because it's just going to keep going faster and faster and faster down the tracks.
Yep.
I love that analogy. It really how that feels like.
Yep. Yep.
And so when you were working at the Air Force, I mean, what was the acceptance of using open source there, and how did that work?
Yeah, for the most part, people were fine with the usage of it. there's a lot of opinions about how you're supposed to interpret the policy surrounding open source technologies. There are some policies where you're supposed to pay for support, and then there's interpretations of that like, okay, well, if we pay for a team that knows this open source technology, is that enough, or do we have to go back to the vendor to pay for it, or is there an advantage to us using open source? And there's a lot of like things to kind of like work through or deal with some of the more compliance or side of things. But generally, as far as usage of open source, most folks wind up actually using it and pulling things in. There are cases where certain projects that aren't well known yet can be difficult to bring in, though, because it's kind of like a who else is using this in the DoD, or who else is using this in this government organization. And if it's something new that you're trying to bring in from open source, that can be difficult because there isn't that sort of built-in trust yet with
Right.
certain things. But yeah, overall usage is fine. I think the bigger thing that I've tried to think about and push is like contributing back and the importance of doing that. Because like usage is one thing, it's cool, but if you actually do start to contribute back, there's a lot of like power that gives you as an organization, and in the direction of certain things, and having your use cases tailored for yourself. And I think that's some of what Defense Unicorns finds with like the Department of Defense. There's like air gap is huge for the DoD, but it's not really maybe for a lot of other organizations. There are some industries where it's important, but if the DoD actually gets involved in open source, and then they can actually drive these sorts of changes upstream. And with Zarf, obviously, it's one project. It helps you with air gap things, but it depends on so many other things. Like when Container D makes a change to the way that they interpret image pulling from local host addresses, which is a thing we've run into. Like then, you have to have a mechanism to resolve that. You have to have a way to go to the Container D maintainers, talk to them, and say, hey, here's this thing. Is there a way we can work around this? Work together, come to a solution, and then commit it and get it merged in and released. And without that engagement, then like you're basically just cutting yourself off. You're saying, okay, well, this technology's lost or done to me. I can't do anything with it because it doesn't fit my use case. When really like a few lines change maybe could make it fit your use case, and then you could take advantage of it.
Right. It almost sounds like Defense Unicorns is one of your value adds to the Department of Defense is the fact that you can provide that vendor relationship to an open source ecosystem and deliver something that looks a lot more like a product to the DoD, although you're actually leveraging your open source community to do that. And from a business model, it seems to make sense because it's easy for you to do Zarf in the open, because I'm sure that as you find more air gapped industries that are interested in engaging and participating in that community, you're providing a service, so to speak, to the DoD, where you're using tools like Zarf to be able to deliver that. So it seems like it's a really nice match between what the DoD needs and a way to actually sustain an open source ecosystem based on what you're delivering and the value you're delivering, which is tangential to the open source, but you're pulling value and getting paid for something else.
Right. Yeah, and the hope is that we can bring other defense contractors kind of along with us. I mean, there are other ones. Lockheed Martin has an OSPO, an open source program office, and there is other movement in this space. And like the hope is that like this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. If we can bring them into open source, and it helps to it helps the DoD to take advantage of all this technology, but it also helps the taxpayers. I mean, this is their money ultimately. And so that kind of feeds back, which is cool.
How are you finding building a community around Zarf? Have you had much uptake, and what have you been doing to make that happen, and how's it been going?
Yeah, I'd say it's been a lot of fun. It was kind of my first experience building an open source community and seeing how that works. So I did a lot of reading from some of the Mozilla stuff. They have some community contribution guidelines and some of the tips and tricks that they've learned about like, reviewing PRs in 48 hours. And if you wait for 7 days or whatever, then the contributor's not likely to come back and stuff like that. And it's been fun to kind of go through those things and sort of see what happens, when people try to contribute and whatnot, and what's the balance of building a community, building a product, obviously still taking care of business needs and kind of managing all this stuff together. one of the things that we found some success with, which was cool, but we also had to kind of pull back a little bit from, was like creating good first issues with Zarf. I kind of I used to joke that they're kind of bait a little bit. Like, you just, like, I would tell the team, like, steer clear of this issue. It's not really that big for us, but like, we're just going to put it out there. We're going to label it as good first issue and see if somebody comes along and swims along and picks it up. And so that was cool to see people actually come and pick up some good first issues and then start to be involved in the community, and then grow it from there. And you have to be careful of, like, some certain things. Sometimes people see something and then they'll want to contribute, and it could drag your backlog down, and you have to manage that and have to figure out like how all of it like actually winds up flattening out in the end. But yeah, it's definitely been a lot of fun.
Have you done much in the way of presentations or anything at various events to pull in more industries? Because
Yeah.
critical infrastructure in general, right? There's lots of, I'm in telco currently, and so there's clearly a need for doing air gap and that kind of deployment and monitoring in the telco industry. I can think of several other industries off the top of my head in the same boat. So getting that word out that that's what you're doing with Zarf. How's that gone?
That's gone pretty well. So I did a talk at Cloud Native Security Con with SpaceX, actually, which was
Cool.
one of the customers we worked with for software development in the air gap. And that was definitely a fun talk. I actually got to talk to some of the Artifactory folks, because we were talking about Conan and how that affects the C ecosystem, and really how SBOMs in certain ecosystems like the C ecosystem can be difficult depending on what package managers you have and different things like that. And I actually used Rigs of Rods as an example during that talk. So that's circling back to everything, because it's a C
Nice.
app. So that was fun. But yeah, it's been interesting to see how people can kind of like pick certain things up and start doing things with them. It's been fun to see people all around the world really like see Zarf and then find use cases for it. And sometimes it's like not even ones you'd expect. Like there was like a metaverse game that picked up Zarf. I still don't entirely know like what all they were doing with it, but it's fun to sometimes like see who these GitHub people that show up are, and then like try and track what projects they're actually part of. And then be like, oh, okay, they're starting to use Zarf. That's kind of interesting. And then sort of learning more about their use case and what they're doing with it.
Yeah, that's always been part of the funnest stuff that I've done in working with projects. Is you get the folks that are there in an entire different industry or an entire different use case that you never would have thought of for your
Right.
application. Go, oh yeah, this is something we can use. Yeah, that's always fun.
Yeah, we had conversations around these topic areas on the podcast too. Like I think it was with Jim Hall, the creator of the Free DOS project, and the project is turning 30 this year, and turned 30 on June 29 or something like that. And he was telling us about all the use cases that popped up over the years, and like how someone booted a machine from a vinyl record, or like how someone broke into like a train control system somewhere and like booted like they were showing the screen as the system was booting, and there was free DOS, and he was like, that's pretty cool. And yeah, he was saying the same things, that like all the use cases that no one ever thought of when they created the project, and how that really just takes the ecosystem at large on a different level, and how that keeps your project going. It's just super interesting. As we touched on, like how to build and grow and maintain a community, did you run into any challenges or bottlenecks, like people were not coming, or people were coming, and that created some kind of a challenge within, either community dynamics or maybe as your personal experience?
Yeah, I think probably one of the bigger things, we were able to get GitHub issues and PRs and our Slack stuff going without too much trouble. The big thing for us was the kind of the community meetups, and what do those actually look like, and how do we like do these more in person kind of events? Because I didn't have a lot of experience with that. I know they did, like Jeff McCoy, the who was head of Zarp before me, and so we initially had like it's how do you target that audience wise. We had initially kind of built some stuff around our following on LinkedIn, but then are those the folks you really want to attract because they're more of the like the people buying the product, more the business side rather than like the actual contributors. And then we switched to trying to doing it in our Slack, which was building a community there, but then we were doing it in Gather, and then it's like how do you get people into that, and is that the right platform to really do these meetings in? And now we're kind of like falling back on Zoom now that everything's kind of like gone to the Linux Foundation with OpenSSF, and that's starting to kind of like actually get a little bit more traction and be part of the ecosystem. Learning what pieces are more important. Like a lot of people live off of mailing lists, and we kind of don't really have one. So it's like that those kinds of things, what people kind of expect or the expectations is sometimes you have to like do a lot of learning and reading to figure out like what are those pieces that you're missing and how do you bring some of those things together in the end.
So are you in the process of creating a mailing list, or is that still
Yeah,
something that you're
yeah, Sarah has taken over the project now, and she's working with Xander, who's our head of our open source projects, and they're both going to be building up mailing lists and making it a little more normalized with the rest of the community.
so we can say that you need to listen to the community, and if there is something that is missing, then eventually it's a better approach to implement it as opposed to keep redirecting people to other places that you do have.
Right, right. Yeah, kind of go with the flow, see where people are, and know where your community congregates. Like for Zarf, it's been really around K8s, Kubernetes stuff. So like that's kind of where your home is in many ways. So yeah.
Yep. Path of least resistance.
Yep.
At the beginning of our conversation, beginning-ish, you were talking about how I think at the Air Force, it was okay to use open source, but there was pushback in terms of contributing back. If you remember, like what were the biggest reasons for them to say that using is okay, contributing is not okay? Like, were they fearful about something, or it was more around, the resource allocation and giving things away? If you remember what the concerns were, what the arguments were, or if you have an experience to share in terms of making that argument.
Yeah, there were two main fears. One was that some sort of proprietary information or would get out into the open source product, and then how do you deal with that, or how do you do those things? And then the other concern was how do we advocate or argue for taxpayer money, for stewards of taxpayer money to be spent on this other thing, this open source. It's not really part of the mission of the Department of Defense to contribute back to open source. So how do we advocate for that as well? The first part is not too complicated. Is policy, and certain organizations have like review processes by which that they go through. I was able to start the ball rolling with the last organization I was at, which was good to work with a few government civilians and the commander of our squadron to get actually like the wing involved and being able to have like an open source like kind of office that we could actually release some of our projects under open source licenses. And that actually happened after I left, but it did happen, which was really cool to see. And then the other thing that to answer the other part, that was really sort of quantifying the importance of a given open source project to us and how we used it, and then why we want to be maintaining it in some way. So one of the things that we used a lot of Ansible at one of the places I worked, and they we used a lot of like open source Ansible playbooks and things. And so I advocated, and it's mostly a paperwork drill, but advocated for some of our contractors to become maintainers and be paid on government time to maintain these because of the importance to our infrastructure if these things went away or whatever. And so basically for that, it was a lot of quantifying how we use them, what they're for, how, all this stuff. And then kind of pushing that through and getting it through. So yeah, a lot of it is like, it's not so much that you'll get a ton of resistance because a lot of people don't like know or don't really have an opinion one way or the other. It's mostly that they just don't feel like they can, and then they'll kind of come up with the, either excuses or things, or they're not aware of enough of policy, and so it's kind of a lot of it's going out and doing research, finding what those policies are, and then what you can use, and then putting it all together into a bunch of paperwork that you submit and can get signed off. Um, and so yeah, so that's usually what I kind of ran into, and then how we dealt with it.
So a good practice is to not just focus on the why you would do this, but also on the fact that you can do this and this is how you would do this. So make that sort of part of the argument, not just the reasoning behind why we should do this, but also how.
Yeah, how and who and what exactly, like, we had named people that we wanted to have be maintainers on those Ansible playbooks, and yeah, how we would do it, how much time we would dedicate to it and whatnot, various things like that.
When you say that it would be great for more of the contractors, the DoD contractors to also be involved in open source, do you know if there is one or a few specific things that keep them back, or does it vary to a large extent what the reasoning behind not to is?
Um, I think it varies somewhat. I think one of the bigger things is mostly just kind of trying to answer the question of why, because they have a long history of doing things the way they've always done it, and it's worked for them for a very, very long time. And so, what is the benefit to them giving away their stuff to their competitors for free? And yeah, and why would we do this? There are definitely like some very good things that people are doing. Like I mentioned, Lockheed Martin has that OSPO. They have Hopper, and a couple other projects that they're releasing as open source, which is really cool to see. But I hope that gets expanded and becomes more normalized. Right now, it isn't fully, like, it's not part of the corporate culture. It still is like a separate thing, sort of on the side. Um, but hopefully that can change over time. And there are people in those places that are pushing for that really want to see that happen.
Have you ever had the experience of convincing someone who was sort of dead set in this is how we've always done it, and at least until I'm here, this will be how we are going to keep doing this?
Yes, yeah. Usually I'd go around them. I don't know. That's usually there's a way. In the government, there's so many people that, like, you can kind of do certain things in different ways. And so yeah, I think there's a lot of, like, certain things you can answer their questions in certain ways, but then also find ways to bypass them, because it's kind of a lot about who you know. And if somebody tells you no in the government, they're like usually just one voice in and amongst a whole bunch of other ways to get to somewhere. And it kind of them telling you no doesn't exactly matter. And I think a good example of that is when we were first trying to deploy the Tinker Planner tool to production. We had, at the time, in like October 2016, we had no plan, like, for how to get this to a classified network. Like we had to get it from a random office in San Francisco, California, out to a separate terminal in Qatar. And so, trying to figure that out and work through how we might do that was interesting. There was a couple different organizations we talked to, like Hanscom Middle Cloud. We started talking to NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, who had been working with Pivotal, the contractor we were working with at the time. And we even were like, well, let's just ship some servers out there. Like, how hard can that be? And so I had tons of phone calls with all of them. I even at one point called the Qatari consulate to check import restrictions for servers, and like all this other stuff. We actually got, when it was coming down to the wire, we kind of had plan A and plan B. Plan A was NGA, because they actually were really good partners to us. But if they couldn't come through in time, we actually did buy servers, and had them shipped to Mountain View, California. And so it was kind of like this: hey, if we can't get a yes from NGA, then we're just going to do this other thing. we wound up getting ES from NGA, and it wound up going there. The servers arrived and then went into storage for a while. But that was for the cost of those servers, it was a valid enough like opportunity cost to, in my opinion, to the government, because we were saving hundreds by the time it got into production and under full use, we were saving hundreds of thousands of pounds of fuel every day, which for $150,000 in servers is going to pay for itself in a very short period of time. And so it's kind of, how do you make that work and work around the people that tell you no, and realize like the other opportunities you may have to get somebody else to say yes, and those partnerships.
It's interesting. I mean, you obviously work with the government, so that's where your examples are coming from. But I do have the exact same challenge from the same old usual business, corporate, proprietary environment, where you just have the people who almost refuse to even just listen to you because they know that you're going to say something that they don't want to hear. And it's interesting how you say that often the best method is to find the person who's open to listen and go from there, as opposed to keep running in circles and accepting that something is not going to happen just because one person said no. I like that one.
Yeah.
And yeah, I definitely also share the experience of not stopping where that one person said no. I would probably not be sitting where I am today if I did.
Right.
But yeah, I was curious to learn what your experience was, to see if you figured something out that, that I couldn't in the past. The other thing that always interests me, if there's any kind of, I don't know, educational material or different ways to describe open source that we could do that would help with these situations, so you don't necessarily have to go around the person. I mean, sometimes people are just stubborn, but in the few cases where they're not that stubborn, I don't know.
Yeah, I think some of it also is also like sort of shocking them with reality, and too, in some ways, and that was something that worked with Kessel Run in some ways. Like one of the things we were talking about, getting our applications into production. Then once we got through NGA stuff, we started transitioning things back to the Air Force, and through that process, we were kind of going through the security control stuff, and sort of explaining how, like, well, they would ask questions and kind of be standoffish about, like, well, we don't know if we like this or don't want that, and plainly, we also told them that then, okay, if you're not going to accept our update, are you okay running Windows Server 2003 in production in 2017? And so if you can also learn like certain things. If you have enough information, you can learn something about something that they are doing, that they're implicitly agreeing to by keeping the status quo. You can also sort of shock them with the status quo in that way, and that can often get them to change their minds about whatever you're proposing, because they'll realize, oh crap, yeah, I didn't think of it that way. Yeah, we should probably update this. And okay, cool, you've got a solution. So that's another thing that I've used, at least in the past.
Before we depart, could you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech and absolutely nothing to do with open source? Any kind of a hobby or a fun fact that you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, for me, it's interesting because it's like, what is tech? Because it's like, it goes back to what about the 1800s? Is sewing tech? At some point, it is. But yeah, I think probably the most interesting fact is that probably I like to work out with Just Dance. So I still do that on my Xbox One. It's a lot of fun to just do whatever and then get to work out there. And that's part of, like, finding something that, if you want to do something, you want to accomplish something, find a way to do it that you're passionate about, and that you believe in, and then and you can get behind, and then you'll do it. And so maybe this ties back to open source, but like my way into open source was through the Department of Defense and caring about that mission, and so that kind of builds that passion and pulls things through.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is.
That's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you...